Panawaza.
Hello and welcome to Shaka Extra Time, a show that comes to you every Tuesday. Hello Shaka, how are you?
Hello Paul. You say how am I? I have to tell you again that I am simple, easy and awesome.
Very, very good, very good. A warm welcome to you all our Facebook followers are watching us live. Shaka Extra Time is a show that comes to you every Tuesday. And today we'll do a sort of a recap of some of the events that happened last week. We'll start maybe in Zimbabwe, where we saw hundreds of thousands of people show up to mourn their late president, including several African presidents. Shaka, your reaction?
Regarding?
The Mugabe, the send-off of Mugabe, the burial that turned out to be a sham for Zimbabweans.
Well, by the way, for your information, Paul, the last time I checked, he has not yet been buried.
The funeral, I mean.
There were some, mass, ceremonies and what have you, but he apparently will not be buried until after 30 days. And that is perhaps because, from what I have heard, President Mnangagwa said that they have to build a mausoleum. They have to build a mausoleum, and that would, of course, be in the Heroes' Acre. Initially, there were problems because the Robert Gabriel Mugabe family had, in fact, wished to have President Mugabe's body buried in his home place, because obviously they do have the anger that the man was overthrown, and they didn't wish or want the people who overthrew him, even though he had been in office for about 37 years, to be the ones that would actually have the last word on where he gets buried. But he's going to be buried in Heroes' Acre, and that is where, by the way, his first wife, Sally Heffron, from Ghana, who was very, very much revered by Zimbabweans, a woman who was really liked very much, celebrated, because in fact they even used to call her Amai in the local, I think, Shona language, meaning the mother of the nation, because apparently she really was very environmentally friendly. She was very helpful to those in need and all that kind of stuff. And they buried her in Heroes' Acre. So it's probably fitting, some say, that Mugabe should be buried in Heroes' Acre, almost next to his first wife.
Interesting. Ironically, Mugabe seems to be calling the shots even when he's in his death.
Oh yes, but he was a great man. First of all, let's face it, you cannot take away the credit that this is a man, for example, who was Zimbabwe's independence leader. He was the man that ushered independence to a country that was known as Rhodesia, Southern Rhodesia, a country at one time that was owned by a gentleman by the name Sir John Cecil Rhodes, a man who has left a legacy with a huge fund at Britain's Oxford University called the Rhodes Scholarship, the Rhodes Scholars. And you know that the United States at one time had a president who happened to be a recipient of that honor, and that was Bill Clinton.
Interesting. A lot of people have given Mugabe credit for some of the things that he did, the resistance, fighting colonialism. But at the same time, his critics say that by the time of his death, by the time he got kicked out of power, he had driven that country almost to its knees.
Yes, I think that, Paul, again, it comes to some of the issues we have been talking about in the past, about really why African leaders, if in fact they are leaders, not rulers, they should at least find some wisdom in figuring out how to manage their exit from State House. Just like there's so many so far on the continent that have been able to do that. When you think about Mugabe, he was not the only person in Southern Africa who had managed his own exit. The Madiba of South Africa, for example, did that after 5 years. And you know how much he's celebrated so much, even in his death. In fact, he probably became more popular, not only locally but internationally, in his death. And then you go north of Zimbabwe, you go to Zambia, and you have the founding president, Dr. David Kenneth Kaunda. He managed his exit through a democratically conducted election which he lost to Frederick Chiluba. And the man was smart enough, courageous enough. He was an officer and gentleman by essentially conceding defeat with grace. And as you saw him, when we paid the courtesy call on him last year, he is very much revered by Zambians, and he's there. And then you have another man who was also president of Zambia, Rupiah Banda. He also lost an election, democratic election, conceded defeat with grace, and there is life after State House.
Shaka, you bring up a very interesting point. Let me do a quick follow-up. How about those people who say that in death, Mugabe was seen by some as somebody who deserved that credit, but again, as demonstrated or as seen on television, people refused to go to bury him. Yet a lot of people are divided along lines of saying he was a great hero, and others were saying that he was just a dictator who destroyed Zimbabwe.
Well, there is no question that at the end of the day, Mugabe should be seen and viewed in the context of being a human being. He should really be put in the context of saying, as a human being, you are not the type of person that cannot do some bad things. You do some good things here and there, and he did, especially when it came to the fact that he was able to liberate, or at least to lead the group that liberated his people from colonialism, from, in fact, the government that was led by rebel Prime Minister of Southern Rhodesia, Ian Smith, who was leading a small minority of white, some might say racists really, who did not believe that Zimbabwe would be independent. As a matter of fact, he was so arrogant enough, and I'm talking about Ian Smith, to the extent that he said never even in 1,000 years would Zimbabwe be politically independent under the indigenous Africans. And of course, he, in a way, had to swallow humble pie on the 18th of April, 1980.
Let's move along. Let's go across the border to South Africa. The country is still reeling from attacks, homophobia, not homophobia, rather xenophobic attacks that have gripped the country over the last couple of weeks. Your reactions?
Well, it must be a very, very serious situation, really, because the president of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, has actually decided to skip the United Nations General Assembly, which takes place in a week's time. And because he said that he needs to stay at home and focus these are his words, not mine, focus on the critical domestic issues. And we are talking about xenophobic violence and also violence against women. So it must be very, very serious. And you know, of course, South Africa happens to be a regional economic power on the African continent. It has economic tentacles all over the continent. When you talk about MTN, for example, the telephone, telecommunications, it's pretty much all over. And you know what they did in Nigeria in terms of retaliation and all that kind of stuff. You have these grocery stores, very advanced grocery stores or shopping malls and all that kind of stuff throughout the continent pretty much, providing a lot of employment and what have you, but also earning a lot of revenue for South Africa. And he has to be very careful because in order for South Africa to retain its current status, it needs to be seen to be part and parcel of the continent.
Let's go to Stanley. What causes xenophobia in South Africa? How can governments, African governments, stop this kind of vice?
I think, first of all, that is a very fair question, but in terms of answers, really, it really is caused by so many things, and especially by a population that is not prepared, for example, to live and benefit in a modern day sort of economy. South Africa is perhaps the only industrialized country on the African continent, and yet it has a lot of people who are South Africans who never had the opportunity, for example, to go to school and pick up some of these modern technological skills or skills that or skill sets that are very, very important in terms of a modern economy. And therefore, they do not have really the ability to benefit from what is theirs. And they see people who look like them, who come from across the Limpopo, for example, from Zimbabwe, from far away Zambia, from the Democratic Republic of Congo, from Kenya, from Egypt, from you name it, Uganda, and what have you. People that are doctors, for example, medical doctors, doctors that have clinics, who operate on people, who treat people, and obviously earn a good living, stay in good neighborhoods, drive good cars, have a good life. And they feel jealousy of the fact that they are not able to be those people. And somehow they feel jealousy, it's a human thing, and they become very insecure. And they start looking for somebody, in fact, to blame for their own problems. And they think that these people, engineers, doctors, lawyers, professors, and what have you from other countries, are taking what belongs to them. They are also participating, for example, South Africa is almost like a welfare state because they have what you would call a very advanced system of health care. And these people take advantage of that, and schools, and you name it, and what have you, and they feel like something is wrong somewhere. The government has not been able to address effectively some of those needs.
Shaka, then what does that say about the ANC? They have had the privilege of being in charge for at least the last 20 or so years. In fact, about 25 years they have been in charge. How come they talk about emancipation, they talk about empowering the black people? How come they have failed to deliver for black people?
Well, you see, in fairness to the ANC, you have to understand that something that took decades or centuries is not going to be corrected in one decade or 2 decades. If you talk about change, change is always really going to be better viewed in the context of being a process and not an event or an incident. Of course, when you are standing by, it's like a very local saying in Runyankore Ruchiga that otariho tagwerwa muti. If you are not in a certain position, the tree is not going to fall on you. And when you talk about, for example, who won and who lost, in American lingua, they talk about when you analyze the football teams, who won and who lost, you do that on Monday because the contest takes place over the weekend. And they call it Monday morning quarterbacking.
Interesting.
And so it becomes very easy for us analysts sometimes to look at the ANC and say, look, you guys, you came to power in 1994. You have African or black people who are occupying, you know, once the mansion that was occupied by a white man under apartheid and all that kind of stuff in Pretoria. You have black people who are occupying very cozy jobs, driving very, you know, beautiful cars and stuff like that. What about the ordinary people? No, there's no question that they have not done enough. But I think they have actually been trying. I have been to South Africa a couple of times, and I have been shown projects, for example, in terms of housing units and all that kind of stuff. More people are going to school, for example. More African, black, indigenous Africans are actually attending universities that were once pretty much reserved for others. Yeah, so there is something going on, but they still have to continue and figure out. In fact, as I said last week, I think, you need something akin to a Marshall Plan. And especially with regards to education, they should put in place a policy that makes sure that education, not only for black people, but for everybody in South Africa, education should be a right, not a privilege, from kindergarten to university.
And they have the resources to do that?
Well, if they don't have the resources, they can look for it.
Let's move along. Let's go to Uganda. We seem to have a lot of people in Uganda who says Shaka. They're asking how can the United States, a foreign country, freeze assets of the former Inspector General of Police? Maybe to put that in context, let me go to a quote here from the U.S. Department of Treasury. We are targeting Uganda's former Police Inspector General of Police, General Kelly Kihura, for using corruption and bribery to strengthen his political positions as units under his command committed serious human rights abuses. Maybe help us put that into context. Why is it important?
Well, first of all, it is very important in the sense that the United States is an ally of Uganda and is an ally that provides a lot of aid to that country, which aid, of course, is used in so many different ways. We're talking about combating AIDS. We're talking about combating tuberculosis, malaria, and what have you.
Defense, they give some money.
A lot of
security.
money for defense. I'm sure you have met a lot of military officers who have come here for training.
That's correct.
Police officers and what have you, and people from other ministries, whether they are in Ministry of Finance, whether it is Ministry of Justice and what have you. And therefore, because they provide aid, it is a key development partner, so to speak. I think that it should also seek or be interested in how that particular aid is used by that government. So I think that there is a justification for that.
So, but why single out one individual? Here, when you read the report, it talks about an institution, but in this particular case, they focused on the personality of Kihura and his immediate family members, including his wife and two children.
Wait a minute, that could be, in fact, the tip of the iceberg.
What do you mean?
They are probably trying to establish a precedent. Once they nail one person, eventually they will move on someone else. Because if in fact they get a man like General Kihura, they're probably going to interrogate him or to interact with him to find out where he was getting orders from. After all, a lot of things that Kihura was doing was not really doing them on a personal basis. It was not for personal benefit. It was for the benefit of the institution that he was heading, and the institution was a major government institution. And he always said that whenever he was criticized for perhaps doing things that appeared really to be very unfair, some key opposition political parties like a Colonel Dr. Chiza Besigye, for example, he would say that he gets his orders from above. Now the question is, when you talk about above, what are you talking about? Are you talking about heaven, where God is reputed to be occupying space? Or are you talking about the political head of a government in which Kihura was working? In which case you're talking about a Ugandan president, Yoweri Museveni.
But the Ugandan president, in fairness to the Ugandan president, is not mentioned here. They only talk about the person of Kaire Kihura, the general, who was head of the police force in Uganda.
You are right, but again, you see, Kihura was not working for Kaire Kihura, nor was he working for the people of Gisoro, where he comes from. Kihura was working for a government which is led by a Ugandan president. Kihura had a boss who was a minister, for example, of internal affairs. Kihura had bosses. Was he, in fact, doing those things for himself? First of all, we need evidence. The fact that it is the United States government which has taken that kind of position does not necessarily mean that we should not ask for evidence. We need evidence, and this evidence must be incontrovertible, Paul, meaning not liable to falter. Because when you talk about assets, for example, that Kihura owns in the United States, or whether he has deep pockets in terms of bank accounts and what have you. Of course, the United States government is likely to do that in a situation where the sort of crimes he committed were under its jurisdiction. Or perhaps it could also go on a diplomatic offensive by trying to persuade and influence its allies, including, by the way, the government of Uganda. But we need evidence, again, that is incontrovertible, because don't forget, by the way, that there was a time in the 90s when the United States, along with Britain, invaded or went to Iraq on the basis or justification that there were alleged weapons of mass destruction. And I'm sure you haven't forgotten that at the end of the day, even though they had been actually told by the United Nations, people who were looking at those things, that they were not there, at the end of the day, they actually found that there were no weapons of mass destruction.
Yeah. Shaka, you and I have talked to a lot of people, and we are in some more sort of shape we've been able to corroborate that information regarding the evidence that you just alluded to. A lot of people, when you talk to people who worked for the police force, whatever, they say In terms of being corrupt, Kihura was arguably not as corrupt as people think, but maybe how the United States got him was his abuse of power. He used that power that he had, that had been handed to him by the president of Uganda, really to unleash terror on Ugandans. Maybe that's the one side where he fell short.
Well, it's quite possible, but again, Kayihura himself, by the way, has spoken. He has spoken denying, for example, some of these things that are put on him by the United States authorities. So the only way we can be sure of what, again, it's about the evidence. But I think that when you think about it, at the end of the day, Kayihura cannot win. Because there is a saying that if wealth is gone, nothing is gone. If health is gone, something at least is gone. But if character and integrity are gone, everything is gone.
How about Kayihura's defense? He says that he did all this with the help of the United States FBI. So could I argue that the US FBI was complicit in all these crimes?
Well, first of all, there is no way the United States government would have taken the steps that it has taken without getting the evidence, without getting the information from some of its intelligence security institutions. And the FBI is one of those places really where you can find some of this information sitting. So there is no way that they must have something on him. And look here, they have been training, for example, their officers. They have, for example, the ability to monitor 24/7 what is happening not only in Uganda, but throughout the world. So they must have something there. The only problem is, what about the person that used to give orders and instructions to General Kayihura? What about the person that occupies a position that used to promote a person like General Kayihura? There is the appointing authority, who sometimes he refers to as the man from above, because he used to say that he got his orders from above.
Let's do a quick follow-up.
But what is very ironic, though, is that you are not, when you talk about General Kayihura, you're not talking about a very ordinary general here. On the contrary, you're talking about a general who happens to have 2 law degrees, one from the prestigious Makerere University, your alma mater, law school, a Bachelor of Laws degrees, and you also have a man who has a master's degree in law from Britain's prestigious, the London School of Economics. So this is not a man that is naive about laws. This is not a man who can plead ignorant about not knowing what he is actually doing or breaking. Can you imagine a man who is so highly educated, a man who is so highly exposed, to find himself in a situation like that?
We've run out of time. I wish we would continue this conversation. Until next time, thank you so much.
You're most welcome.
It's been a pleasure.
The feeling is mutual.